So 38 people potentially saw what was happening and chose not to do anything or call for help. Today I'm going to tell you guys about the murder of Kitty Genovese, and this case forever haunts so many people, especially communities in Queens, New York. So this occurred on March 13th of 1964, and our victim's name is Catherine Susan Genovese, but she goes by Kitty. So Kitty was 28. She lived in an apartment building in Kew Gardens in Queens, and she never made it home after a bartending shift. Before I tell you all the details of what happened, I wanted to talk a little bit about Kitty. So she was described as having a sunny disposition and being, quote, self-assured beyond her years. She was married once, but it got annulled after a year when she ended up coming out as lesbian. During the time that she was attacked, she actually was living with her girlfriend, Mary Ann Zilonko, and they had been together for over a year at this point. Kitty had big dreams and goals. She was working doubles at the bar with the goal of saving up enough money to open up her own Italian restaurant. So at 2:30 a.m. on March 13th, Kitty is leaving her job as a bartender and driving home. As she is driving, a man sees her while she is waiting at a traffic light. He has been parked on the side of the road just waiting and watching, and when he sees Kitty, she strikes his eye, and she is driving home not knowing that he is now following her. By 3:15 a.m., she ends up arriving home and parks her car in the lot less than 100 feet from where she actually lives. As she starts to walk towards her building, the man that had been following her in his car approaches her with a hunting knife. She sees this and tries to run, but he ends up catching up to her and he twice in the back. She screamed, quote, "Oh my God, he stabbed me, help me." Several neighbors heard her. No one realized it was a cry for help. Don't know how, but one neighbor shouted, quote, "Leave that girl alone," and the guy ended up running away. And Kitty, now seriously injured, crawls into one of the building hallways where no one could see her, and she is just trying to get any sort of help. But again, even though people have heard this and someone even yelled, "Leave that girl alone," no one has gone to check on her. No one is worried that this girl who's like shouting in the street at 3 a.m. might need to be checked on. No one goes out and checks on her at all. But we do learn from witnesses that people did see him as he was leaving. He entered his car and then drove away, but he returned less than 10 minutes later in a wide-brimmed hat and started searching for her in the hallways. And he ended up finding Kitty laying down on the ground of the hallway. She's barely conscious. She's obviously in a lot of pain, fighting for her life, suffering in silence because no one is helping her. And out of sight in the hallway, he stabs her many more times. He steals money from her and runs away. The two attacks spanned over the course of a half hour, and this entire time, no one really tried to help her. Her neighbor and close friend Sophia Ferrar found her shortly after the second attack. Kitty was still alive at this point. She ended up holding Kitty while waiting for the ambulance, saying to stay with her and that she was going to be okay. The ambulance arrived at 4:15 a.m., but Kitty ended up dying on the way to the hospital. Before I get more into why people maybe weren't calling, I do want to say that 911 and the emergency system was not implemented in New York yet. So it wasn't as easy as to just dial up one number and get emergency services. That just didn't exist in our country at this point. So it was a little bit more difficult to call for help during this time. One person did say later to the police that his father called the police after the first attack and reported a woman was, quote, beat up and staggering around. And I just want to know why he was able to realize that she was beat up and staggering around, but he didn't go out there and physically help her. I don't understand. One other person did call friends for advice on what to do and then ended up calling the police a little while later. Both calls were not really considered that high of a priority, so no one was dispatched right away to go help. 2 weeks after Kitty's attack and murder, the Times wrote an article claiming that 38 separate individuals heard or saw some part of her attack and chose to do nothing, and that this is a prime example of the bystander effect. If you don't know what the bystander effect is, which it also can be called the Genovese syndrome, which is her last name, it's a phenomenon where witnesses are less likely to help someone if there are other witnesses around. So the more witnesses there are, the less likely someone will intervene. This is why when you take a BLS class or a CPR class, one of the first things you are taught is that if you are performing CPR or telling someone to call 911, you designate one person to call 911 instead of just shouting into a crowd to call 911, because if you tell a bunch of people to do something, they're all going to assume someone else did it. But if you point at someone and say, you call 911, then it is more likely to happen quickly and effectively, and help will be on the way faster. So the newspaper newspaper reported that 38 different people heard or saw something about this. We don't fully know that that's true. The only 2 confirmed cases we have are the 2 I already mentioned, but obviously it seems like there are some people that just never came forward and probably did hear something and are just too ashamed to admit that. The guy who called his friend for advice, by the way, trash. We hate him. His name was Carl Ross. He was intoxicated that night, and he said he heard noises and eventually cracked open his door, and he said he saw her laying on the ground and watched her get stabbed. And he still chose to do nothing. He ended up closing his door to his apartment and called a friend, and the friend said, don't get involved. He said eventually he climbed out the window and went to his neighbors to call the police, but that was only after he heard Sophia, the friend, telling people to call for help. So this garbage man didn't try to help her at all. He watched her get murdered and didn't call the police till after it was safe and someone else was there trying to help her. Initially, the girlfriend, Mary, was a suspect. She was interrogated for 6 hours straight, but 6 days after Kitty's attack, a man named Winston Mosley was arrested on suspicion for robbery of stealing a TV, and they end up getting him to confess that he killed Kitty. He was married with 3 kids. His wife was at work as a nurse when he murdered Kitty. He was convicted, and he ended up rotting for the rest of his life in prison. He died at age 81. Kitty's partner, Mary, ended up living out her life as well. She talked about Kitty, and she ended up dying at age 85 earlier in 2024. Mary said that after Kitty's death, she felt numb. She always felt guilty because she was sleeping so close to where this all happened, and she had no idea and wasn't able to help Kitty when she needed it. This case is used a lot as a reminder that the bystander effect is real and very dangerous, and we saw this not that long ago with the woman who set on fire in New York. Everyone watched and no one helped her either.